We believe in this group, in the power of story.
But it didn't work for me.
And it was what made my grandmother tell me all the time, son, you're blessed.
But it saved my life. It redeemed me. It's the way God found me.
All right. Hello, it's Tony Kriz, and this is the Portland Stories podcast. It is a public expression of what has been a private conversation among a group of men in Portland, Oregon over the last 30 years. And today we've got some amazing panel members. We got Janus Sanders. Janus, say hi to everybody.
Hey, everybody.
A metaphoric man, a man about town. And then we got, of course, Larry Anderson, the fountain of wisdom himself. Larry Anderson, say hey.
Hey, what's happening, y'all? Good to be with you once again, Mr. Kriz.
And then our new recruit this week, J.R. Lilly, my former housemate and my Navajo brother. J.R., how are you?
Good. Yeah, feeling great.
Fantastic. Okay, so today's election day. And you guys got any opening thoughts on election day? It's I hear people talking about how scared they are of mail-in ballots, and we've been doing mail-in ballots here in Oregon since carrier pigeons. So for us, it's the easiest thing in the world, especially when days look like this. Nobody wants to go wait in line. Any thoughts?
I find politics as difficult to talk about as religion. So it's a difficult opener because you're exposing yourself. So
yeah.
So let me do that. I'm not going to vote today.
You're not?
I'm not. I got the ballot. I thought about it. I researched it, and I decided it's not about politics for me. It's just I don't want to be manipulated, and I feel that going to the polls, no matter how you look at it, is manipulation.
Interesting. Larry, did you vote?
I did. I've always questioned what we get for our vote.
Right.
People always tell us to vote this, vote that, Democrats, Republicans, but I always wondered, what we get for our vote. Nobody talks about what we get for our vote. And so far, we get very little for our vote. I mean, this is the first year since I've been voting. I voted every year that I've been eligible, where there's some serious violent implications. I mean, where I live, there's been violent civil unrest for the past 4.5, 5 months.
Right.
Every night. Just last Saturday, we heard flashbangs and explosions. We heard a bunch of crowd noise. I looked at the news the next day and discovered that people had mobilized in Laurelhurst Park, and then they went to Lloyd Center and created a bunch of damage to the buildings. One of the persons said they were protesting capitalism. We went from a protest that was about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd to now it was a confrontation over Trump supporters versus people voting for Biden. And now this protest against capitalism. We are just, and this threat of violence on this election is probably the first time that I've ever experienced that, where people are threatening serious civil unrest in the midst of a COVID-19 virus to go to war depending on who they believe should be the president. And I think it's just absolutely outrageous. And it's in the backdrop, Tony, of everything that's already been happening. And so it's a very worrisome thing for me. The outcome, regardless of what it is, it seems to be that we're going to be experiencing a violence encounter with a lot of civil unrest, regardless who becomes the president.
Yeah, civil unrest. What an interesting phrase. Civil, a word that means polite. It means citizen. And then we link it with the word unrest. I want to talk about civility. I want to talk about civil society. I want to talk about civil rights. I want to talk about civil discourse. I want to talk about civil citizenry. This is a time where it seems like civility is gone in so many ways, like what Larry's talking about. And we're all connected to Portland, Oregon in one way or another. And Portland has been the sort of stage. It's been a political football around topics of violence, protest, policing, Black Lives Matter. It's been a nut show. So what does civility look like in a world like this and on a day like this? Because guys, trust me, tonight's going to go crazy. I mean, it may go crazy, and tomorrow's not going to get better. Thoughts?
Well, for me, the reason why I'm not going to vote is kind of important for me, because I'm a type of guy who likes to look for truth. And it's impossible to find artifacts of truth. In the beginning, they were hieroglyphs on a wall, however you look at it. So now everybody's sort of defaulting back to their cultural truth, something that they were taught and they committed to a belief system. And in this day and age, it's really relative thinking or like thinking instead of absolutes. Even though people are looking for this absolute truth, they're using relative, you versus me, us versus them, and it's causing all these disturbances and problems. So one of the reasons right now that I'm not going to do that is I think one of the truths is that we're all manipulated. So how can you really commit to a decision based on a strong belief when embedded in voting is utter manipulation? I just can't bring myself to do that.
Huh.
And so it's causing civil unrest because people are looking for the truth in the midst of manipulation. And it's just causing a lot of problems.
So how do you live out your civil responsibility, your civil participation in society then? How do you do that? Where do you do that?
Well, for me, I'm coining this phrase, no ledge. It's like taking knowledge and breaking it up into two phonetic words, no and ledge. It's kind of where I believe we are. Our conventional wisdom has failed us. That's how I see it. And so I think as a person who's an engineer, a scientist, I put all those relative language and those relative things aside for this idea of the absolute. And in the Bible, as far as Christianity is concerned, God calls himself I am. It's an absolute term. And so my thinking is that there's something to that. I'll just leave it at that. I know that's a little bit ambiguous and a bit of a metaphor, but right now I don't feel at liberty to kind of dive into that. It's personal.
Okay, let's so Larry, you're a retired police officer. You obviously have a lot of thoughts on safety and policing and security and protecting and all those sorts of things. And civility, this idea of civility equaling like peaceful, like, peaceful, appropriate communication, appropriate discourse, even appropriate protesting. Sure. But simultaneously, civility has been used to dismiss anyone who's not of the majority culture. The civil rights movement was referred to as uncivil. It was rude. It was rude to just go sit at those counters and just claim you can do it. Just use whatever bathroom you want to. That's very rude. And it's very rude that you would go and stop traffic, and all this sort of stuff. Very uncivil. So how do we negotiate this world where these two things are simultaneously true? Or are they simultaneously true?
Well, I mean, Tony, you bring up a lot of interesting points. First of all, to have civil rights, you have to have cooperation. And right now, nobody cooperates with anybody. In the majority culture, they were basically saying, as long as you are compliant to what we decide is the best for you, then they saw that as being civil, as opposed to understanding that we need to cooperate with each other as people, not allow our differences in culture, opinion, skin color divide us to the point where we become hostile towards one another. And that we have to rule over each other and attack each other. Think about what civil rights has devolved into. If I don't agree with you, or you don't agree with me, or you take another position, then I am justified in attacking you.
Right.
And with the name calling and the total disrespect, there is no, in a civil safe community, people with different opinions have to learn how to cooperate with one another, not compete.
Right.
And so what we have is this total lack of respect, cooperation, people now using differences to separate and attack with violence. And this is what we call disturbing the peace. So what you were talking about, Tony, earlier was people being compliant. And people saying, well, the majority or the dominant culture saying, as long as you are compliant, what we consider to be normal for you, then we'll be civil towards you. The minute that you're not that, or we think you're not that, then all bets are off in terms of how our behavior towards you. And that gives us the right to attack you. And this is what our culture has devolved into. And this is the part that makes it scary. You can't have any kind of serious conversation that results in any kind of difference with how people are attacking each other, calling each other names.
Right.
I mean, we got, we don't have civil discourse in government or debate anymore. We have yelling and screaming and name calling.
Yeah, from the highest levels.
I mean, and this is
loser, dumb as a rock.
Fat
pig.
If you don't agree with me, you're a fool.
Immigrants referred to as animals.
Oh man, it's and all this dehumanizing.
Totally.
And putting labels on people is to justify dominating, subordinate cultures, in your opinion. And there's no civil discourse in that. It is strict compliance. It is subjecting people to someone's will and authoritarian position. That has nothing to do with civil discourse.
Okay, this is from the Institute of Civility and Government. They define civility is about more than just politeness. Although politeness is a necessary first step, it is about disagreeing without disrespect. Seeking common ground is a starting point for a dialogue about differences, listening past one's preconceptions and teaching others to do the same. Civility is the hard work of staying present even with those with whom we have deep-rooted and fierce disagreements. It is political in the sense that it is a necessary prerequisite for civic action. It is also political in the sense that it's about negotiating interpersonal power such that everyone's voice is heard and nobody is ignored. Any thoughts? It sounds like what we try to foster in our community, our little community together. Space for disagreement. Even
this whole notion that we live in a democracy is a misnomer, and that's what people are being confronted with. We're supposed to live in a republic with democratic principle, our representative government, but we don't live in an oligarchy. We live in a culture that's ruled by a few elite, and yet we want to keep this disguise up like we're some kind of democracy. People of color have been voting for years, ever since they were allowed to vote. And what have we gotten for our vote? What have we actually gotten for our vote? What position have we attained as a result of our ability to be able to vote? Has our status as a culture of people changed? We own 1/2 of 1% of all the wealth in this country when we were released out of our captivity in forced labor. Today, as a cultural group, we still own 1/2 of 1% of all the wealth in this country. What have we gotten for our vote?
Fascinating. JR, jump in, bud.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that's been said. So as a person that works in government, so I work for the city of Portland, and lately the conversation has been interesting. So with the Black Lives Matter movement going on, so for years in government, I've been talking about we need to address some of these inequities. We need to listen to BIPOC voices. We need to support our BIPOC leadership. Kind of how do we do that? And for years, it's been my advice has been ignored. It hasn't been okay, well, that's good advice. We'll take it under consideration. Now all of a sudden, in these committees, in conversation with different bureaus, they're like, oh, all the advice I've been giving them for years now are starting to resurface and like, oh, Jared, you mentioned this thing. Like, how do we do that? What do we need to do? Let's set up a meeting right away with, the top leadership and figure out how do we then have this conversation, How do we actually address the needs of the BIPOC community? All these inequities that have been just kind of pushed away for years now is kind of being brought up and addressed. How do we now design our programs? Because designing programs, it's not going to happen overnight. We got to get it, through this process. Is probably not going to happen for another 2 years for it actually to be implemented, and then for the results of that to happen, a few more years down the road. So it's like a big ship turning. And so when I hear civil unrest, when I hear violence, those things, I see that in the streets. I see that in the riots. I see that with conversations among people. But when we're talking about addressing the role of government, right? Deciding where resources go, deciding how policy is made on certain things. I think some of the conversation is happening. I think it's, people are disagreeing, but I think it's happening pretty civil. That conversation is happening. Politicians are one thing, but those who are working in the government, those who are actually making decisions on, bureau directors, some of the things I'm hearing and seeing, I think it's happening pretty civilly. But I'm hearing and listening. So what do we, when we're talking about, are we focusing on the violence in the streets and that's the state of our city? Or is it some of these other places where we need to be, I'm seeing civilly, am I missing something or?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, basically you have to understand you have to have civilians have to cooperate with authority. But to have authority, you have to be submitted to that authority. You have to be under authority in order to have authority. And right now, there is an attack against anything that represents any type of authority. And the concern is that authority is acting out on a public without being under that authority itself. So there's no accountability. So the enemy of our souls, the one who wants to create chaos in our communities, understands that we have to continually to keep people wanting justice, but never ever realizing it. So that you keep people angry, you keep people in the straight, you keep people waiting for justice that never happens. And then once that anger is stoked through the media by showing these incidents over and over and over again, and then having the outcomes fall short of any kind of real significant remedy that holds anybody in authority accountable, this is how you create chaos and civil unrest. This is what we're seeing in the street. And to scapegoat law enforcement community, by the way, who definitely needs to have serious reform. Nobody's arguing that. But to scapegoat them, okay, to say, well, they are the reason of all the ills in the community, is so that they don't have to talk about the real problem. And the real problem is, hey, man, I don't see anybody being able to afford to live in their communities. I see thousands of homeless people on the street. Okay, I see a whole lot of people who have mental issues that are not even being serviced or even considered. Unemployment is at record levels, but then you hear people talking about a sound economy. But people can't get jobs and get work. They don't have health care. These are all the kinds of things that destabilize communities. People are in the street because they're out of work. They can't go to school and be a part. And they're seeing in the media all these injustices that are happening by people in authority who don't seem to be under that authority. And then the outcome of the investigations or the redress is that nothing happens to them. Nobody's held accountable. This is the ingredients for creating chaos. Then you have an election year now that is stoking the flames on both sides, fear-mongering, creating fear. And now you got people who have no faith in any kind of government authority. And so what do? They start taking to the streets themselves. They start organizing and becoming the authority themselves. Once you start doing that, you are no longer under authority. You now become the authority. And as anybody gets to decide at any time what is right and act on that. This is how you create chaos. This is what's happening for the first time I've ever seen in an election year, as our communities, especially in Portland, has destabilized to the point where people are having armed conflict in the street and the police are not even responding to that. That's scary, Tony. That's scary.
I was talking to this guy yesterday who's spent most of his life in politics. And he said that he's like, oh, this election, this time that we're going through right now, we've been through this before. We've done this many times as a country, and we always come out just fine on the other side. Do you feel that way? The three of you feel that way? We've been through this.
Is he talking about a civil war?
I don't know. But he said it, and he seemed very.
We've been through a civil
benign.
war before. We've been through a civil war. I hear people saying they want a civil war. I tell people, do you understand what civil war means? That's a whole bunch of white people killing each other about black people. And we got a whole lot of that going on right now. A whole lot of white people are mad about what's happening to black people, and they're attacking each other. And unfortunately, for black people and people of color, we get caught in the middle of that. We get caught right in the middle of that. And so my advice to my friends of color is to stay out of the middle of that. You got white folks in the street attacking each other about Black Lives Matter, or at least they say that's what it's about, and declaring war on people. That sounds like civil war to me. It sounds like the civil war that we all participate in the cover-up of, where you had white people killing white people about black people and people of color. I mean, that was a civil war. And it sounds like, yeah, we've been through this before. The question is do we want to go back to this? Is this what we want to do in 2021? We want armed people in the street fighting each other? Because that's what's been going on in my neighborhood just about every night. And we are way past demonstrating anymore. It's just armed confrontations in the street now.
Vast majority white?
Mostly, overwhelmingly white. Overwhelmingly white. Now, when you look on the media, and for the media press conferences, you see some black people. But what I'm seeing every night in front of my house is white folks and young white people.
Right. But it's necessary for the narrative that people of color are in the middle of it, right? Because people of color that are the violent ones. They're the savages, and civilized citizens are not. And who were citizens? None of you were citizens, not according to our founding documents.
Not at all.
None of you were fully human.
And when you're stoking, fear and causing people to feel like they have to protect themselves from something, you have to create this boogeyman. And for a long time in this country it was the Muslims, but now it's always been the local black terrorists.
Interesting. It is interesting that we've moved on past Muslims now.
Now it's a local black terrorists again.
Mexicans and blacks are sort of the new bugaboo. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But remember, Tony, the interesting thing about it is that you have young white folks in the street fighting each other over
right
the black folks, on both sides. Whether you are for Black Lives Matter or you're against Black Lives Matter, they're in the street fighting each other.
Right.
About that by the thousands across the country.
JR, you haven't been a part of Friday Group enough. You got to learn to jump in and just talk over the top.
Yeah. Thank you. I hear that, and some of my friends, some of the folks that I am in conversation with, they would categorize, prior to protests, prior to taking in the streets, the life that was lived, what you just described about homelessness, all these inequities, healthcare, they would describe that as violence against them.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that the world was, prior to anyone fighting in the streets, there was already violence happening against BIPOC community members, low-income families, immigrant and refugees. So, you know, it's sort of materialized now in protests and folks going at it in the streets. But prior to that, violence was already happening. And we already were in a very contentious environment. And I think what Larry says was just right about BIPOC community folks being caught in the middle. How do we, people using us as pawns, and how do I engage in that? Because I don't want to be part of the violence. I want to be part of a solution, but I don't know what the solution is. Is the solution that I go and I vote and I engage in the government system? Is it that I educate myself about what's going on? You said, is this election season sort of for me, I'm like a younger person, so I haven't had that many elections I've been through. So I'm experiencing that, I'm going in and I'm wondering, what am I supposed to do as a person of color, as someone who believes in justice, some of these things. I don't want to go out in the streets, and I don't want to fight. I don't want to be used as a pawn. But so what am I supposed to be doing?
That's the question. What does from our collective brain trust, what does civility look like?
Well, Maya Angelou, I'll quote her. She said, "Hate has caused a lot of problems, but it haven't solved one." So what happens when I see people in the street protesting? Now I see hatred.
Right.
I see people hating things. I don't see the protests that I've experienced in the past against injustice.
Right.
I see hatred.
And it seems like we're building a system where we're increasing the number of walls between me and the person that's different that I could be listening to, right? It's not just that we have different opinions, but now we have, violence and, mob, and then we have all the political rhetoric, and then we have the media rhetoric, and all this going on. It just seems like we're, as opposed to coming closer to where we can actually have these conversations, we're pushing each other farther away, getting more and more walls in between us. So no wonder we can't hear anything. And we talk about listening, right? That's part of what this group talks about, is how do we learn to listen to one another? Jesus referred to himself as a stumbling block. Yes, Jesus is a stumbling block, but how can we remove from every other stumbling block from the conversation? So only Jesus is a stumbling block that we're dealing with together, as we're fighting through these things. Any thoughts?
Something that no one really considers is that all of these problems are because our civil society doesn't work. The laws, the rules, the cultural norms, we are at the end of it. It actually doesn't work. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that this is happening. We have a capitalistic society, commercialism, we've got manipulation on global scales, we've got foreign actors manipulating things, we have domestic terrorism. All this stuff has been there, not to mention a weakened market. So we have an old, antiquated free market. And so all this stuff is collapsing. And it's because systemically, it was bound to fail in the beginning. Now, the question is not that we can point out all the facts of what's wrong with it. The question is, are we going to use the same rules, laws, and technology to try to solve it? Or are we going to do something different? And I think that people who don't know what to do is causing all this fear and problem, because they think that violence is a solution. If I can just bully someone into doing what I want, everything is going to be better. It's not. We actually have to think differently above it. We have to pinpoint what's wrong with the system and come up with completely new and innovative ideas. One of the things that I recommend, systemically speaking, is transparency. It's the one thing that we don't have. We've also removed our ability to judge one another out of our culture. And you actually need to make a civil society work. So the real question is really about us. How can we bring our own transparency back? because people like to hide in the complexity. We like to hide in the fighting. We like to hide in all these things, when really we just need to say, this is who I am. Why don't you judge that in the midst of what I'm doing? I judge you, and let's resolve that.
On a national scale, it seems to me, and I may completely hate myself for saying this, but I wonder if we need to let go of the myth of American excellence, that America is the best, because so much of what keeps us from being able to actually hear one another is the fact that we're moving at a breakneck speed because we have to be the best. We have to have the most money. We have to have the biggest military. We have to win every battle. We have to be the world's policeman. We have to do all this stuff. Meanwhile, Canada's having conversations, and Australia's having conversations, and we just don't seem to be able to figure out how to do it, partially because I think we're just we're trying to live up to some lie.
Well, even bigger than that, it's pathological. When you go back to the invention of the World Fair, we introduced this idea of exhibitionism. We told the whole world we're better. When you come over here, when you benefit from what we're doing and what we got, which is really rooted in slavery. But once you come over here, look, we're actually using water to water the desert dirt to make it grow green. We have these big skyscrapers that are touching the sky. We are not only the best and the excellent, but we beat everybody else out. Come on over to our side, be our friend and our ally. And so we have this deeply rooted, unique American belief system that it's part of our core value system. And so when that is challenged, you have something called perception perseverance. And if you go Google that, it's like drowning in water. It's like taking a big deep breath underwater. No one wants to do it.
Yeah, I wonder if the COVID narrative is going to help to unravel some of this American exceptionalism mythology.
I think it makes it more complex, because when you look at larger regimes like the political regime, the tech giants, the sports giants, and now we have bioengineering, and I think that it's really, medicine should never have been the answer to all of our problems. Now medicine is coming and saying, hey, I'm the answer to everyone's problem. And that is causing a bigger issue, because now I have a magic pill for your answer. I think that we should definitely take a step back and, reevaluate COVID-19, medicine, the World Health Organization. All these things are kind of connected in finance and everything else. So when you unravel it, it gets complex.
Well, but I mean, Janus, what you're talking about, goes to the heart of what the issue is. The disparity that's been created in this country, that made this country great, was predicated on a lie, and then we've been practicing and participating in the cover up ever since. And so we have never been really sincere and honest about our history, and so we have this delusional belief about who we are as a people group that's predicated on lies, and those lies simply aren't true. And so we're beginning to experience the latter stages of the unfulfilled promises of a lie. And that's what makes it a lie. And so now the only salvation out of that is to go back and tell the truth. And for a lot of us, we are totally blind. We have no understanding about our history. And so if we don't understand our actual history and come to terms with that, then we're bound to replicate the lie and continue to practice the deceit and try to prop something up that is unsustainable, that only is going to result in violence, because that's the way it was promoted in the first place, was through the violent suppression of minority culture groups. And we've never, ever have dealt with that. And that in itself is the judgment. That's what ultimately results in the judgment of that cultural group, is when you base your system of government, your financial institutions, on lies about who you are and who you think you are. And so that's what we're facing now. So we're looking at the results of those lies, and people are delirious with it. that you can't even really begin to talk honestly about your past and how you created the disparity. And it's been manufactured, and it was done, by design. And we never talk about the color code in this country.
Right.
And that white was at the top and black was at the bottom of the color code. And that was by design. And it's even had an effect on minority groups because, the lighter you are, the more trustworthy you are as a person within the minority groups. And so we're all affected by it. And so and you're not going to resolve it if you can't even, now we've gotten to a point where Tony said we build walls and we can't even have a conversation about it with how people being offended. Anytime you got people trying to confect a Confederacy that was an enemy of the state that killed Americans, that's ridiculous. And so, but again, that's that delusional thinking that it was something other than what it actually was, which was a attempt to destroy this country. It was treasonous. And now you got people running around here pretending like it was something else. We have white domestic terrorist groups that have been terrorizing people of color since this country's inception are now trying to be like there's some kind of a club, or there's some kind of fraternity, and they've never been designated terrorist groups. And they've actually been co-opted into the law enforcement community, which by design were to keep slaves in their place and to return them when they escaped. That was the bedrock of the law enforcement community. We've never gone back and dealt with the truth of the origin of these institutions that we now worship. And when these institutions begin to fail us because they're not based on truth, they're not based on decent humanity towards one another and love, they're based in hatred and racist oppression. And when you're unable to deal with that, to even have a conversation about that without people going crazy, then this is what your country looks like in the end. This is what it looks like.
Yeah, I definitely think there's, it started with a lie, like everyone's saying, and then we keep having to cover up more and more to keep the lie alive. American exceptionalism, thinking that we're the best and the greatest nation. So we have to keep making up for it. We have to keep progressing. Sort of same idea with we have to keep growing our national GDP, gross national product. Otherwise, we're in a deficit. We're if we're not producing as much. So we're going more and more into debt. More and more, we're enabling policies that are driving and supporting these things. I think there needs to come a point where if we're a nation, we're unified and we're having a conversation. Maybe it's time to take a step back and take a look at things, take a look at some of these practices. I'm reminded of things like the Jubilee laws, where there's a sort of a reset. Slaves are let free, the land is allowed to rest, debt is canceled, redistribution of land, some of these things sort of so that nobody can continue to accumulate wealth over generations, and that the land and the community can kind of rebalance itself out. I think some of these things, instead of just continually needing to grow, continually needing to be the best every single time, I think that's definitely hurting us and causing a lot of the inequities.
Well, but if you don't, so those laws and those sanctions are put in place from our Creator. But if you don't acknowledge the Creator and then try to use His laws, then you end up worshiping yourself, and then you become the origin of it. When you deny Elohim as the Creator, and then you want to try to use His laws and precepts and concepts without acknowledging Him, then you end up worshiping yourself, and then you replace Him with yourself, and so you use His words, His laws, His statutes according to your will and your understanding, and that is. And this is where we see ourselves in this country. And when COVID-19 hit, we have a government that decided that they didn't have any way of saving American lives. And so they decided to work on saving the American way of life. And so we start talking about our economy as if the economy is what brings life to a community culture, and the effect or the toll on human lives became secondary. And so when you fall into a country where people are more concerned about their way of life than they are about the people that make up the life, then you're worshiping something other than the creator. And so you now create the image of yourself. The American way of life is something that we're all forced to bow down and worship, even while the people who are subject to that lives are dying at an unprecedented rate daily. And that's being ignored. And then what we see in the political climate is people promising to preserve the American way of life. And the question is, who are those people that benefit from that?
When I become offended by someone having a different perspective than me, when it offends me, when it stirs up anxiety inside me, where I want to run away from that person, or I want to close that website, or I want to change that channel on the TV, or I want to run away from that neighbor down the street, because what's happening right now, I'm feeling offense because of it. That is because my belief system has become an idol. It has become my identity. It's become who I am. And how dare you offend my precious little ideology that I believe in? Please do not. It's offensive, so I'm going to run away. Where, I mean, the Jesus way is defined by reaching out to the neighbor. It's defined by, I'm unoffendable because I know in whom I've believed, and I know who believes in me. So I can navigate these waters. I can go forth and be a person of peace. I can excel at that. I can sit with my neighbor that I disagree with, and I can ask questions and say, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. Am I hearing you correctly? And then I speak it back, and they go, yes, that's what I believe. Explain to me why that gives you meaning. Explain to me why that's so valuable to you, because I want to understand. I disagree, but I really want to understand why that's meaningful to you. We've lost the ability to have those conversations, and our culture is not helping us.
Well, when this person you refer to, Jesus, became white, and we deified whiteness, and then we demonized everything else. And so then white became the standard,
probably the greatest example, right?
Associated with everything that's right in the world. And, you know, our job is to go out and enlighten everybody. And enlighten meant make people white as they can be. And that white became the cultural norm. White became the very definition of America. When the Constitution was written originally by white men, it was written for white men. White people. It was not written for people of color.
Right. And I don't want to deal with the other's opinion. So I will literally push them into ghettos. I will push them into reservations. I will push them away so I don't have to deal with it. And I can live in a world where I perceive that it is actually this way.
And even when they come out of those things in their attempt to communicate, they will have to bow down to whiteness. They will have to bow down to the way white people deal with and communicate. And everybody will bow down. If you don't bow down, you will be wiped out. You will be locked up. You will be destroyed. And we know that there's two ways to destroy a man or woman. You can kill them, take their physical life, or you can destroy their ability to have a livelihood. And this is what we see in this country. That's what creates the disparity in this country. This country is not poor. There's just a great disparity. And so that disparity is what's causing all this civil unrest. The injustice associated with that disparity is to the benefit of one group at the expense of the other. And it's self-fulfilling because within those minority groups, they can perpetrate white domination on themselves. The more I cooperate with the white culture, the better I can be off as long as I'm within my own domain. And therefore, I become oppressive. I get co-opted by the very oppressive culture that I'm trying to dismantle in order to survive.
Yep.
And that's what makes it so hideous. And so what you see is, I look at JR. I see a Native American who's very light complected. He can work for the government. because he can meet that, almost white criteria, color. Whereas the darker skinned Native brothers, they get discriminated against. Because Janus can accept white culture all he wants to, but when he walks in the room, he's a black guy.
Yep.
Okay, JR can accept white culture all he wants. He walks in the room, and maybe because of his skin color, I might be able to tolerate him a little bit and pretend like he's not as threatening, as long as he keeps his mouth shut about that Native stuff.
Too much.
Yeah, as he keeps his mouth shut about that Native stuff. And Janus, he's at the very low end of that pole as long as he doesn't start talking about, benefiting black people. Because benefiting black people would be at the expense of white people. And so this either or culture we live in is totally against what our Father, our Heavenly Father, has designed, because this culture is predicated on one group only benefits at the expense of another group. In my Father's kingdom, he says, when you cooperate with one another in a love culture, we all benefit. And there's no room for disparity, because we've created a community that is beneficial to the least of these. Well, we're so far removed from that we've become blind to people living on the streets in tents right in our own community. Can't see them.
Right.
And if we do see them, we see them as the other or a nuisance. Do you realize that the overwhelming majority of homeless people, and I'm not talking about transients or vagrants, I'm talking about homeless people, are white?
Right.
And there's no way to make a distinction between when you're dealing with a transient population, when you're dealing with vagrancy, or when you're dealing with homelessness. And because you have a system that treats it all the same, that sameness is destroying us. And this is what the police culture has devolved into, because it's been left alone in dealing with all the problems.
Yes.
Because they've removed all the social safety nets, to go do something else, and then they just call the police on everything. You got a homeless person, call the police. You got a person having a mental issue, call the police. If you have somebody who's having a problem at the post, at the bank because they can't get them, call the police. And so when the police show up, and then the police show up and respond in the way that they do, and then you hold then you hold them responsible. Nobody else has to be responsible. The police are ill-equipped to deal with this stuff. Then you hold them accountable. Then you want to hold them responsible for all the ills that's happening in our society, which you're ill-equipped to deal with. And so they become scapegoated now. And so now we're in the street quotation police
and
accountability.
how many of those issues could be dealt with just by being good neighbors? By actually just knowing the names.
The majority of them.
And being willing to engage and to living close to home, where you're not constantly in your car separated from people who are different than you, or it's amazing
And so the scapegoating now we can focus on all the social ills and talk about police accountability, so we don't have to talk about all the uncomfortable stuff that we're seeing that's happening in our culture. And I can be blind to that. I don't have to be human anymore, Tony.
All right, guys, let's move to final thoughts here. Everyone, just one last final thought on this topic of civility in these times, these troubled times. Your hope, maybe for society, or some closing thought maybe you haven't had a chance to say. Janus, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think that is a deep cultural belief, and also a lie, that we can't do anything about what's going on here, especially white men, but also black men. We're willing to believe that when you look on the resume, top to bottom, the privilege goes to the white guy and it gets distributed down. But I think in order to right the wrongs that have happened in our culture to this point, we actually need to take full responsibility for what happened. Until then, we truly will believe the lie that we can't do anything about it.
Thank you. JR, closing thoughts, bud?
Yeah, I'm just thankful. So I'm the young guy here, and I'm constantly looking for, because I'm going to be in this fight. I feel like I'm just getting in this fight for justice, fight for our community, and looking to those who have been in this, and what can I do, and how can I, as it passes on to me, what are the things I need to be aware of? What are the things I need to learn? So I'm going to constantly be learning, but I believe there is ways where we can bring balance back to things. I don't know the solution, but I'm open to constantly trying to find it and to keep doing the work that I need to in all areas. And I think the thing, the stuff we'll see on TV, protests in the streets and these inequities are symptoms of the much greater problem, which I'm still trying to understand more. And I'm just thankful for hearing and continue to open to learning more.
Hey, and JR, just really quickly, you need to let us know how to be your friend and your uncles in all of this, right?
Mm.
And
yes,
not stay distant, because
Yeah.
Larry,
Yes.
last thought.
So Tony, I mean, first of all, we need to be able to hear one another, and that requires having our ears open so that we can hear. And then we need a serious return to our Creator, and we need to be forgiven so that we can learn to forgive one another.
Mm.
And as we learn to forgive one another, is only going to occur when we return to our Creator who has forgiven us. And as we then serve our Creator and learn how to serve our Creator, we will minister to his people, to the people that he's concerned about. He's concerned about people. And we do that in the service of our Father who's in heaven. And when we really return to him in repentance and really start serving him, we'll minister to the needs of the people. Because remember, he says that what you do to the least of these, you do to me.
That's right.
I think we got ministry backwards. We think that by somehow doing these things and all, and we're serving the people, that we're actually, getting points with the Father. And the Father says, no, when you really understand what I have done for you and how significant and important you are to me and the length I've gone through, and once you understand how much I love you and forgiven you, and then in my attempt to pay respect to him, I will actually serve the people. I will minister to the people. And that's what we need to do. This is a giant ministry. We're in a big old family fight. And we're not going to straighten this out until we have the peace that comes from our settled relationship with our Heavenly Father. And once we begin to do that, then we can begin to listen and to heal one another in the forgiveness. Because we're not like the people out that are causing that's promoting the hate. Because our Father has changed our hearts and has given us a new spirit. And so we need to demonstrate that in the public setting. We need to get out from behind our church walls, and we need to go out into the places where the people are, and we need to learn how to love them. And the way you love them is you hear them first. Can you listen to them? Can you respect what you hear? Can you see their humanity in spite of what their belief system is? And can you address the needs of the humanity because your Father has given you the will? And so for me, that's the beginning, Tony. It's not going to come from government. It's not going to come from politicians. It's not even going to come from religion. It's going to come from a change of heart. And as our Father changes our hearts and our wills towards him, we will see other people as our brothers and our sisters and treat them accordingly. I think that's the beginning. I know it sounds corny. It used to sound corny to me when people say it, but that is the truth.
Right on. All right, everybody. That's Janus, Larry, JR, my brothers. This is the Portland Stories podcast. Thanks for being with us, and we'll be back again in a couple weeks. Break.
Struggle.